All right, so welcome everybody to our February What's Bugging Your Jersey from the Yard webinar. Tonight we have Kelly Gill from the Xerces Society, and her topic is Mythbusters, the truth about what's bugging your yard. Just before we get started, a couple of logistics here. Please enter any questions you have into the chat. And again, make sure you address them to all panelists, and Kelly will pause once or so to take some questions, and she'll take most of them at the end of her talk. So enter them in and we'll relay them to Kelly. And I just want to remind everyone that we are recording this webinar, and the link will get onto the Jersey from the Yards webinar 2021 webpage tomorrow. It takes a day for me to get the link, but if you'd like to watch it again, it will be on our website. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Kelly Gill. As a Xerces Society pollinator conservation specialist and a partner biologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Kelly provides technical assistance on pollinator conservation in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region. Her work includes planning, designing, installing, and managing habitat for pollinators. She also works with Xerces staff and research partners to develop technical guidelines and provide training on pollinator conservation practices. Kelly completed her master's degree in entomology at Iowa State University. Okay, Kelly. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Oops, messing up already. There we go. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to all the hosts and moderators. I am so happy to be here today. I wish we could be in person because this is kind of a fun topic that can be pretty interactive. But first, I'll go through kind of an introduction, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of things. And so it's, this presentation is called Insect Mythbusters, and my job, as you can see on the screen here, is as a pollinator conservation specialist. So I am focusing on flower visiting insects in this case for the most part, but I will welcome questions about other insects as well. One thing to know, and you'll see it during this presentation, is insects are the most diverse group of animals. And so this topic can be complicated because insects do weird things, right? There's always an exception to the rule. So there's usually not a never or an always involved. So please keep that in mind. And it can be tough to grapple with when we're trying to sort out, how we perceive the insect world, how we perceive their habitat and their value. Just to talk a little bit about the Xerces Society, we are a member-supported nonprofit. Our mission is to be a science-based conservation organization, and our focus is protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. So as many of you can imagine, invertebrates are the foundation of the food chain. They do many ecological services that keep our, ecosystem and environment functioning. They're bioindicators of habitat and water quality. And they have a lot of other benefits that we're going to talk about today. Our goal is to work on science-based conservation with diverse partners. We work with a lot of scientists, land managers, land-grant universities, educators, policymakers, farmers, citizens, and community members like you. So we have a really kind of wide reach and breadth of our work. And so I would really encourage you to visit our website to learn more about that. We won't get to that today. Or you could contact me directly with questions, and I'll give my contact information at the end. If you don't know what the Xerces Society means or stands for, we get that question a lot. We keep our name is after this butterfly you see here, the Xerces blue butterfly. And this was a Western species, but this is the first species to go extinct due to, human landscape change, and other development. So we're really trying to integrate how we interact with our landscape, how we manage land to not let this happen anymore. As we know, and we'll talk about this a little bit, we are still seeing insect declines. This was a particularly rare species in the West, in the San Francisco Bay Area, tied to very specific habitat, so it was a specialist. And in some cases, we think, oh, rare things, yes, they're declining, they're already rare, but we're seeing bigger, more precipitous declines in insects in general. And so what I really want everyone to take away from this is that insects are really important. They run the ecosystem, but they're often overlooked, underappreciated, and that's for many reasons. You know, they're small, they're hard to study. We don't know a lot about some species. There's not enough funding to study certain species. So as we go through this presentation, you know, I hope you take away that, you know, we really need to do more work in this area if we think we're going to conserve other plants and animals. My role is mainly on the ground conservation, so doing conservation planning for habitat restoration on a variety of scales. Most of the time I'm working on working lands, so farms, land trusts, and other places. But we also do habitat work in our communities. We work with gardeners and a whole wide range of people, partners, landscapes. And this is really because, and we'll talk about this later, you know, these insects are very widespread in a lot of cases and need landscape scale conservation, which makes that really easy for a lot of people to be conservationists. And we'll get to that a little bit later. What you see across the top where it says pollinators, conservation biocontrol, agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticide protection, urban conservation, Be Better certified, Bee City Campus USA, and other community and citizen science projects, those are our focal programs, and you can learn more about each of those online. Let's dive into the fun stuff, right? So invertebrates are important. The vast majority of described species are beneficial, right? So when we think about invertebrates or bugs, we often think of pests who have gotten, you know, the lion's share of attention over the years, and rightfully so, because these are, you know, insects that have some kind of economic value to people, whether it's through crop protection or human health. You know, we tend to focus on that. But with over 1 million species described, we have a lot of them that are really critical to the functioning of our ecosystem. So if we look at this pictogram here, the size of the organism depicts the proportion of diversity it represents. And you can see by this beetle that insects are the most diverse group of animals, right? Other arthropods like spiders and mollusks and sponges, echinoderms follow closely behind, but insects in the rank of diversity are the most diverse. Okay? So why is the most diverse group of animals largely understood or underappreciated? We'll get to that question. First, here's a little snapshot, and this is a very small snapshot with some factoids of the importance of invertebrates and their annual value. Now, before we go into this, I would like to make the plea that, you know, the intrinsic value of nature should be conserved. You know, that should be our focus. But as humans, we really want to know, what do these animals do for us? You know, that human-centric view, and what is that worth? So here's a study that was done, actually 2 studies that came up with some metrics, and the annual value of ecosystem services, which we'll get into here, what that means, is estimated to be at least $70 billion in the US annually. I want to emphasize that annual. And this could come in the way of things that people don't notice or that go unrecognized. For instance, here you see this dung beetle rolling up some dung. Not a sexy job, but invertebrates are responsible for the decomposition of over 90% of human and animal waste. If we didn't have these invertebrates that perform that function, it'd be a very different world, right? Related to that is the recreation industry. Insects are the food source for fish, for birds. So hunting and fishing and those types of activities that humans spend a lot of money on annually in gear, in trips, in outings, really relies on insects. Here you see in this picture a stink bug. Yes, we have good stink bugs. That can be one of the myths right there. We can't put all of these insects in the same category. But you see this black and orange predatory stink bug feeding on a herbivorous stink bug, right? So it's a carnivore feeding on a plant pest. And although they're related in the same family, they have different life histories. And then, of course, we're all aware of the value of pollination that wild bees bring us. Added on top of that, the value of introduced honeybees. Okay. Before we get started here, getting into the thick of things, I do want to not forget to say this, so I inserted this slide here. There's a new paper out. Our executive director, Scott Black, is one of the authors on it, and it's called 8 Simple Actions That Individuals Can Take to Save Insects from Global Declines. So I'm sure you've all heard about, insect Armageddon and insect declines and these news stories that are coming out that are showing, pretty bad statistics on the decline, not only of invertebrate animals, but wildlife in general. And I think this paper will mention some of these tactics as we talk throughout this presentation. But I think this is a great overview and offers some really simple suggestions for people. And that can be everything from wildlife friendly and pollinator friendly gardens to larger habitat restorations, down to thinking about, how you manage your property. And it can be things easy as reducing your light pollution, which can be an impact on things like nocturnal moths and our fireflies. So you don't always have to have a huge plot of land. One good thing about insects, and which is quoted here from our director, saying the cool thing about insect conservation is that anyone could take part. Eliminating pesticide use, replacing part of your lawn with flowers, and turning off your lights can all help insects. And there's a lot of other recommendations in here. If you don't have control of a piece of land, like I don't, I live in an apartment, although I would love to give them suggestions. I don't think they're really looking for them, but I could get involved in the community. So you could think beyond your own yard, your apartment, your piece of property, where you live. Think about your town at large. And this is a really great paper. And I did put it as a link in the presenter file. So I don't know if that's showing up, but if not, I could get it to everybody. So because I focus on pollinators, in particular native bees, I'm going to kind of narrow down the myth busters to pollinating insects, and that can be anything really that visits a flower, and some insects are better at it than others. But what we're talking about here is flower feeding insects that visit for nectar or pollen or both, and in the process they carry pollen from one flower to another, right? And so there's a lot of misconceptions about what a bee is. And I started off as being a honeybee keeper. And I thought honeybees were really kind of the prototype of bees. Bees are social. They live in a colony. They live in a hive. There's a queen. There's workers. They have this kind of division of labor within the hive of bees of certain age performing certain tasks, all mediated by this chemical communication. And really, that's not true. Um, a very, very small percentage of the world's bee species are social, only about 10%. So about 10% of the bees live like are or live like honeybees. Most are solitary nesters. They do not construct hives or live in colonies. In the US, if we're talking about native species, bumblebees are the only truly social species. They do have a colony. It's different than honeybee colonies, which are perennial. So the workers in a honeybee colony will overwinter with the queen and emerge the next season. Bumblebees found annual colonies. So they do things a little bit differently. And this is very important because even though a lot of the same tactics in conservation apply to social and solitary species, there are some differences. And to really do a good job at conservation, we need to target the biology of these species and make sure that we are giving them what they need for their habitat, not only in the summer, like you see here when they're visiting flowers, but throughout the rest of the season, throughout their whole life cycle. So I like to use a little cheesy quote saying, we can't just be a flower weather friend, which is likely the most interesting part of pollinator conservation, because we want to get out in our gardens, we want to see the beauty of flowers, and we want to reap the benefits of actually visually seeing bees and butterflies come by, and kind of the fruits of our labor are very apparent. Other pollinating insects include wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, and beetles. They all pollinate at different levels. There are some specialists, there's some pollinators that are better at it than others. So I'm going to go through that a little bit with the rest of the slides here. But first off, one of the questions I often get is, well, is that one pollinating? Is that insect pollinating? Or as my husband will say, is that a good one or a bad one? And that's one of the big myths that we'd like to bust today. Uh, yes, there are insects that are, considered pests by humans. They play a role in the ecosystem, but to humans, they're of some kind of economic value as a pest. Like I said, whether it's reduction in crop productivity or because they may be a concern to human health or other reasons. But this is such a minuscule amount of species compared to the over 1 million species of insects described. So one of the things I get asked most is that a pollinator, is that wasp good? Do wasps do anything good? What's the difference between flies? Are they good pollinators? And one of the things, I want to impress on you today is just being able to recognize this diversity, because that alone is important. We need all of these species doing their job in the ecosystem. And even if species are doing the same job, we need that redundancy, because these animals naturally fluctuate in abundance and year to year, spatially and also temporally. So we need to know what we're looking at if we want to be good conservationists. So here I have a picture here of a wasp. That's pretty recognizable. Here's a honeybee. Here's a fly in the bottom left that looks like a honeybee, sometimes looks like a wasp. And this is a native bee here that's very wasp-like. It's actually a male bee. And because females do most of the foraging and pollen collection, female bees are the ones that have those pollen carrying structures. They're a lot fuzzier. Males can contribute to pollination, but they don't have those particular structures for collecting pollen and provisioning a nest, because they don't do that. And so they're often mistaken for wasps, right? This looks like a very wasp-like bee. So let's look at these characteristics. Bees have these branched hairs. They're fuzzier in general. Like I said, there's always exceptions, but those branched hairs help collect that pollen. and they can collect pollen like you see here, moistened on the legs like honeybees and bumblebees do. But most of our native bees carry pollen grains, loose pollen grains, right? And a lot of them carry them on their legs. You see this bee here is a leafcutter bee. She actually has scopa, that pollen carrying hair on the underneath of her abdomen. Right? So these bees are carrying pollen differently. We'll come back to why that's important here. Bees have 4 wings. They're usually fuzzy or hairy, like I said. They have eyes at the sides of their head. They have long filamentous antennae. And one thing that I think is kind of the ultimate identifier when you're out in the landscape, I mean, these pictures are pretty good, right? So if you're out in the landscape just looking at flowers and things are moving around, it's much more difficult. So the first thing I look for is this insect carrying like copious amounts of pollen? So here you see this bee has scopa on the leg and is carrying all these loose pollen grains, but they also have pollen attached to other hairy parts of their body, right? And they're all different looking. So native bees are very diverse. Here we see a halictid bee or a dark sweat bee. Right below it is a green sweat bee. This may be mistaken for a fly or other insect because we're used to thinking of bees as amber or yellow and black and stripy, or fuzzy like a bumblebee. That's pretty recognizable. Here we have a longhorned bee. And here we have a really tiny bee, and I know we can't tell the difference in scale from these pictures, but it is very, very small. It's a couple millimeters, and I often get asked the question, is this a baby bee? And the answer is no, it's a very tiny adult bee. Baby bees look like little larvae. You know, they have complete metamorphosis, so they don't look anything like they do in their immature stage as they do in an adult. So think of it analogous to a caterpillar and an adult butterfly. Okay. Flies, recognizing them can be tricky too, but they usually have these big bulgy eyes that kind of connect in the center of their head. They're all eyes. And instead of having long antennae, like I showed with the bees, they have these short, really stubby antennae. Often they're kind of thick and bulbous. They're not carrying a lot of pollen. They're not usually very hairy. And they don't have 4 wings and hind wings. They just have 4 wings. And then over evolutionary time, their hind wings have been modified into a structure called halteres. And they look like little lollipops coming out behind or underneath their 4 wings, and they act like a gyroscope. So that's why flies could kind of land upside down on the ceiling. Now this is pretty indicative of a fly, as is this blue bottle fly here. But then we have, it's confusing, right? Then we have flies that look like bees, like a honeybee, but again, those big bulgy eyes. And then we have mimics that look like bumblebees. So when we're trying to answer these questions for people, it could become very difficult. Wasps are a question I get a lot about. You know, they look tough and narrower. They look almost armored. They don't carry pollen. They have very little hair to no hairs. You could see some little tiny hairs maybe here. They often have brightly colored exoskeletons that are shiny versus hairy. And they do have those 4 wings. So we have these social species, you know, things like yellow jackets and hornets that can be very aggressive. But like bees, we also have solitary species. All of them can be considered beneficial in one way or another, but they have different behaviors. So we all know if we step on a yellow jacket nest, they nest in the ground or in cavities, you know, that they'll defend that nest, and they'll send the defenders out to basically protect that queen, protect the workers, and sting you. And honeybees and bumblebees, they're also social. They do something similar. In the case of honeybees, when they sting you, they have a barbed stinger. So their stinger actually gets stuck in your skin, and that's when we see a lot of that venom having a reaction to that venom that's pumped into the body of whoever's getting stung, whether it be us or an animal. Other wasps and other bees, in fact, can sting multiple times. They have a smooth stinger. Most of the time, if you're getting stung by an insect, especially when we're talking about bees and wasps, it's the solitary species who have a nest defending behavior. All right. So we're going to try to change things up a little bit here and talk about native bee biology a little bit. And some of you may have seen this, but this just goes back again to, are all bees social? Are they social insects? Because we frame them as social insects. And in the US, like I said, our bumblebees are social, but that only makes up about 1% of our bee species, our native bee species. Most of our bee species are solitary and nest in the ground in these little holes that look similar to ant holes, and the underground architecture can vary, but you know, that's a per species variation in how they nest and how they build nests. Other bees, our other native bees, are solitary stem and wood nesting bees. We'll talk more about that. So more than 70% of our bees in general are solitary. Very few are social. Most of them nest in the ground. And our social bees only live a few weeks to a month. So they have a lot to do in the time they're active as adults. Right? They have to mate. They have to build a nest. They have to go out and collect pollen to provision the nest. They have to lay eggs, and some of them make different constructions or chambers for their larvae to develop in. And this takes a long time, especially compared to social species who have a lot of workers that can help out, right? So if you see something like this in the soil, oftentimes early spring, you'll see a lot of bees flying around here. These are solitary species. Most of them are in the family Andrenidae or Andrena. They're early spring bees. You could see this female here digging to construct her nest. This isn't a colony, although you see a bunch of nest holes in close proximity. This is a south-facing sandy slope. This is a regular lawn here up in the corner. I get a lot of calls in the beginning of the spring saying, wasps are swarming, you know, there's all these wasp nests. What should I do? Should I spray them? And people often do, unfortunately, contact an exterminator or a service to come, either because they think they're going to be harmed by these bees because they think they're wasps, which they're not, or because, you know, this doesn't look great in their lawn. The species that do this are often active very early in spring, and they go dormant in the summer. So you only see them for a short amount of time. They are not aggressive. They're not defending their nests. They're solitary bees. And in fact, we call them tickle bees. We have school programs where kids actually hold them and pet them and kind of get acquainted with, you know, diminishing their fear of insects and that myth that all of these insects are dangerous and stinging. Another myth is, you know, when we talk about conservation, we picture these bees in general and a lot of other pollinators, butterflies, as these flying, kind of open habitat, summer sunny day insects. In fact, like I said, they only spend a very short amount of time as adults, right? Most solitary bees have an extended period of adult or larval diapause, and they spend most of the time in their nest, right, in the dark as larvae. That's their main feeding stage when adult female bees are bringing back pollen and provisioning that nest. So when we think about conservation, flowers are great. We definitely need that food to raise generations and fuel the activity of active adult bees. But we really need to think about what they're doing most of their life, and that's nesting. So other than our ground nesting solitary bees, about 30% nest in stems, wood, and other kind of cavities, to be general. Here's where there's some variation. Again, many of these species are spring bees. They'll take up hollow stems that have an entrance point. Some of them will excavate the soft pitha stems to create nests and nurseries. Some of them will nest in rotting wood or snags. So although we may look at a picture like this and say, wow, that looks messy or shrubby or unmanaged, it can be very, very, very important for these nesting insects, not only for pollinators, like you see here, this green sweat bee. Most of our green sweat bees nest in the ground. This particular species likes rotting wood. Bumblebees will nest in these brushy areas, you know, underneath some cover, usually above ground, sometimes underground. But then we have all these other beneficial species like tiger beetles and ground beetles that are really voracious predators on crop and garden pests. So this habitat feature here may not look like much, but it is really important. When we think about wasps, again, we have that same conundrum on social and solitary. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people ask, well, do wasps do anything good? Like, what do I need to, tell me what I need to know to not kill them? And truthfully, you know, if you have a wasp nest in the ground or if you have a paper wasp nest in your tree and it's in the way and it's in the way of foot traffic or kids or, you know, kids playing or even your animals, it could be dangerous, right? We don't want to get stung. But not all wasps act like that. You know, very few percentage are social species. Like you see here, this Polistes wasp is social, but it's also gathering tomato hornworms, which we don't want in our gardens, right, to feed their larvae. So unlike bees, wasps feed their larvae live prey instead of pollen and nectar. And in fact, bees actually evolved from a certain group of hunting wasps, except they just switched their diet to be vegetarians their entire life, while wasps will collect prey, live prey, and feed it to their young. As you see here, tomato hornworm, here's another caterpillar pest. But as adults, they switch their diet and feed on flowers. Right? And some of them can look big and pretty intimidating, but most of them are beneficial. As we know, invertebrates are in trouble. It is a problem that, you know, they aren't getting the attention they need. You know, in the conservation world, there's always issues with funding, policy, other things. And I think if we can create, you know, a collective voice about this, we can do a lot better. Right now, at least 28% of North American bumblebee species are at risk. And of course, you've learned that the rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis, has been listed as endangered. Bumblebees are really important, especially for crops and wild plants, but they're one of the pollinators that are really robust to cooler temperatures. So in the Northeast, when we think about the times of year when our tree fruits are blooming, apples, cherries, you know, we could have some pretty rainy, overcast days that are not favorable for other bee activity, like honeybees. You know, they like to stay in like me until it's 70 and sunny, and then I'm like, yeah, I'm ready to go out. But our bumblebees pick up the slack in the meantime. And so we definitely want to keep an eye and not lose that species diversity there. We have a lot of endangered butterflies in the US. Some of them were rare to begin with, but it's very concerning when we see things like monarch butterflies and population declines of 90% only since the 1990s. So, you know, in another couple decades in our lifetimes, we can see a total collapse of these animals. People don't often associate, or maybe when I'm doing pollinator talks, the people that come to them are interested in pollinators, but we have a lot of really important aquatic invertebrates that are critically imperiled. Freshwater bivalves are one of the most endangered groups of organisms total in North America. And these species are really important for water quality, for the health of fish and other aquatic invertebrates. And, things like climate change, warmer waters are really impacting these species and the other species up the food chain that depend on them. And we have many complicated factors that are threats to invertebrate. Mostly what we're going to focus on right here today is habitat loss and also pesticides. But keep in mind, this is a tangled web. Uh, there's disease issues among insects, there's professionals and scientists looking at all of these things separately and how they're interacting in concert. And that's a really difficult job. But something we can all do is be better at managing our habitat, whether it's our yard, whether it's the back 40, a small space, a space in our community, you know, landscapes like we see here with, farmland that's monoculture, fence post to fence post, our urban developments or even suburban developments, this monarch here isn't going to survive very well because you can just tell by these pictures there's just not a lot of flowers, there's not a lot of host plants, and I'm using the monarch as an example, but we can talk about other insects that way too. Pesticides is another really big topic, and we do have a whole team of people that are pesticides experts that are working on pesticide reduction and mitigation and alternatives. And if you have questions, I could point you to them. We have a lot of publications online, including this one, How Neonicotinoids Kill Bees. I recommend you look at those. They're science-based and they have science-based solutions in them as well. But I think a lot of times when we implicate pesticides, we're looking at farmland, we're looking at, agrochemicals and these really widespread broadcast sprayings for things like mosquitoes. Truth is, more pesticides are used per acre in urban and suburban areas than ag areas, including our yards and gardens, like you see here in this picture. And these pesticides, comparable to what's used, like neonicotinoid group pesticides that are used on farms for agricultural pests, are also available on the shelves of our garden centers. And per the label, which is a policy issue, these can be applied in greater concentrations in gardens than they can be on farms and with fewer restrictions. So this is another simple way we can kind of get together in our community and think of other ways, maybe reduce the lawn, maybe reduce these environments that are causing pest outbreaks, or just changing the perception of, what our landscape should look like in general. Many of these pesticides that are used both on farms and in these urban and suburban areas are highly toxic to pollinators. So overall, pollinators need landscape scale conservation. Only 3 to 5% of the American landscape is undisturbed habitat for plants and animals in general. That's a really, really disappointing number, but I think we can all modify the places we work, we live, and play so we don't lose this biodiversity. So I went over this briefly before, I won't spend much time on it now, but whether you're working in the backyard or the back 40, one of the great things about pollinators compared to other animals like polar bears or grizzly bears or big, megafauna is that we could do a little bit in our yard and have a big impact. Food, nectar, pollen, and host plants, shelter, as I was saying earlier, nest sites, overwintering sites. Winter is important for our insects too, even though we don't see them. Pesticide protection, and then again, thinking about our conservation actions and if we're supporting these animals through their entire life cycle. Season-long bloom I've talked about before, and people are probably aware of this, but incorporating plants into your habitat or garden that bloom from early spring through early fall. Leaving the leaves, this is one of those simple actions and probably one of my favorites. And you don't have to leave them across all your grass or lawn area if you want to keep some of that, but piling them up in the flower beds or, in the back, maybe behind the garage, avoiding shredding leaves is really important because a lot of our butterflies, moths, and beetles and more use that either as cover to overwinter or they attach themselves to leaves and overwinter that way. And so it's like a, protective blanket, a protective covering for these animals. And again, having winter cover is really important. So I want to stop here and see if there's any questions. Otherwise, I can go through some examples of what these habitats might look like. If you are thinking about incorporating them into your landscape, I have several examples from large areas down to very, very small areas like sidewalk strip plantings. But first, I'd like to turn it over to some questions, if there
Hey,
are any.
Kelly. We do have a few. So let me find the one I was going to say. Okay, so another Karen has a question. She said, I've heard conflicting thoughts of setting out a bee hotel for solitary bees. What is your opinion?
Yes, so there are many different structures and ways you can do this. Our first line of defense is if you have the space, plant the actual plants that provide that structure and habitat. You won't only benefit bees, you'll benefit a lot of other wildlife. The hotels are great for, an educational tool, teaching people that, not all bees live in a hive. Some of them live in stems or other types of structures. The thing we want to emphasize when we are using them is sanitation, proper sanitation. Because if they're not cleaned, and especially the ones that are, like drilled into 2x4s, like the big wooden blocks that don't degrade easily, they can build up with pathogens, with parasites, with mold and other things that impact the health of the bees and other insects using them. So if you have a system where you're sanitizing them or phasing those bee houses out and rotating them to prevent building up a reservoir of disease, that's great. And you can do that easily by, using natural materials. So already rotting wood, stones, bundling up hollow plant stems that you might have pruned off your existing plants.
Someone else asked, when would it be safe to rake up leaves in the spring?
So I usually use, and there's no perfect answer because of, the life cycle of these insects are so varied, but I usually use bumblebees as my cue. So when I start seeing bumblebee queens out, that means things are happening. We're greening up, insects are emerging, and then I use that as my window of opportunity. So I leave things all winter to really, protect those overwintering insects. Because if you don't do that, you won't have them next year, or you won't have as many, I should say.
Okay, another question is if neonics have been used for a couple of years on shrubs, this person, Jason, has read that it persists for 1,000 days. So he's concerned that even after we stop using it, it will continue to affect pollinators. Is there anything that can be done?
Yes, and so this is a huge issue, and not only in perennial plants. So there's different classes of neonicotinoids within that pesticide group. Then, and I don't want to get too inside baseball here. The publication I showed that I could forward on really explains this well. But the nitroguanidine groups are very persistent. Some of them break down into more toxic chemicals, which is really counterintuitive, and they can remain in the plant. And so, it may not be always a lethal dose that bees get as time goes on, but sublethal doses, so it doesn't kill a pollinator outright when it goes to feed on a flower, but it can cause things like loss of navigation ability, reproduction problems, brain function problems, foraging issues. And so even at low doses, we're seeing those effects. You know, limiting the use or not using it at all is the best way to go. But we also see this with things like neonicotinoid seed treatments. So a lot of our corn and soybean has treated seed, which is not regulated like a pesticide. And there's issues there. So even if you harvest that corn and plant something like sunflowers the following year, we still see uptake from the soil of those. And so, it's a conundrum using more cultural and organic practices when you can, and using chemicals as the absolute last resort when it's warranted is the advice we give. And it depends on the crop and the insect. So monitoring and using that very judiciously.
Someone has asked if spraying deer repellents on plants can harm pollinators.
That I don't know. I don't. I'm sorry. I could look into it.
Kelly, there was one early on regarding, do you say most of the time that we are stung by solitary bees defending their nest? It seems backward, or from compared to the friendly bee or colony bees.
No, that's right. The social bees that have a queen and workers, and social wasps that have a queen or foundress are more apt to be nest defenders. So maybe I jumbled up my language a little bit, but to clarify, typically there are some social groups of bees like honeybees and bumblebees that are more apt to sting when you encounter their nest, right? So they're not defending flowers. So if they're out foraging, they're pretty docile. And even in the case of bumblebees, when you encounter a nest, like the only time in all my years of working with bees, the only time I've ever been stung by a bumblebee is when one flew up my pant leg. So.
And one last question. Somebody says my neighbor hires a company to spray for mosquitoes. They tell him it doesn't harm bees. Is it even possible to spray anything to kill mosquitoes that wouldn't harm bees?
So, there are botanical mosquito sprays that are repellents, but essentially the most effective, way to target mosquitoes is in their larval stage, which is in water. And we do have bee-safe options for that. Overall, aerial or broadcast or terrestrial spraying really doesn't help that much. And so whether it's a chemical that does impact bees or not, it's not getting rid of the mosquito problem. That's kind of those cultural practices like reducing standing water, wearing repellent on yourself or long sleeves, which I know we don't want to be inconvenienced, but those are the best ways to go. And in fact, we have this guide, I don't know if everyone can see it, but I could send it out, called Helping Your Community Create an Effective Mosquito Management Plan. And one of the goals is to reduce those high-risk sprays, like I was showing earlier with the aerial spraying, but also just, localized efforts as well. So reach out to me and I could get you that information. But typically I don't know what the chemical is, so I can't answer specifically on its impact to bees, but I can say that a lot of times those broadcast sprayings aren't effective for mosquitoes. So
one last one. Kathy says, over the last few years, I've found many flies that have died on plants, and I was told it was a fungus. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so there is a fungus that kind of mummifies flies. I know about it. I'm not a pathologist, but we have been seeing that. Was it on milkweed? I wonder, because we have been seeing that as well. And so I don't know if it has a harmful impact or if it's just kind of the natural way of things. But yeah, one of those things that I'm not an expert in.
I think you've caught up to all the questions. Actually, I'm seeing one more if you want to take a minute. Are there
Sure.
any wasps that are predators of bees?
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to get to that I forgot to include is, you know, predatory insects eat beneficial insects. And it's just the way it is. Like we can't be out, we can't stop that naturally, but we can do things such as, not introducing praying mantids, in particular Chinese mantids, to our gardens. They're indiscriminate predators, so they'll eat monarchs, bumblebees, hummingbirds, and other things rather than targeting a pest problem in a garden or on a farm. But we have plenty of other things, ambush bugs, even some of the predators I was showing earlier that will nab a honeybee, bumblebees. It's part of the system.
Okay, I think that's it, and we'll get the rest at the end.
Yeah, I only have, I'm just going to flip through these just to give an idea of, some of these habitats that we've been creating. And a lot of times people think of meadows, wildflower meadows, and they're really honed in on that. But they could be hard to manage and create. So I just want to give you ideas for other options. Oops, here we go. Creating things around riparian areas. Does double duty, protects water quality, also provides habitat for pollinators. Here's a hedgerow on a riparian area. Planting trees and shrubs, I think, is very overlooked, but if you have a small space and you think of a flowering shrub, I'm extrapolating here, but the number of flowers on one shrub can be equivalent to a half-acre worth of single-stemmed flowers. And so that really helps foraging efficiency of these bees and helps them collect a lot of pollen. Um, People gravitate towards these meadows, which is kind of the hardest way to go, the most challenging way, especially if you're limited in the types of equipment you have. Things like these multi-story hedgerows are really, really great. You could get a lot of that early flowering habitat that we don't get from our meadows because those herbaceous species flower later in the season. And if you have a long linear area, I know these are deceivingly maybe look large in these pictures, but they're very small. You can think about building habitat vertically instead of out. So you're creating a shrub layer, an herbaceous layer, mid-story and canopy layer. And we have bees that forage in the canopy, and a lot of them. And there's a lot of pollen resources in our flowering trees and shrubs. So if you can create this layered effect by dense planting, you could get a lot done in a small space. Of course, this doesn't look like good pollinator habitat, right? And I just want to kind of focus a little bit on areas maybe that homeowners or in your city and town can focus on, because I know not all of us have a farm or large acreage. So having, trying to convince housing developments to do something like this, where you see all these wonderful flowering spiderwort and penstemon early in the spring. I think it looks beautiful. This is a hard sell for most people that want a manicured lawn, but I think we could trend toward that way as long as we keep working at it. This is a tiny rain garden in my town of Collingswood. This is at our community center, and it's chock full of not only flowering plants. This is a little early in the planting and in the season, so you can't see a lot of flowers, but it also has these really cool features like stumps and snags built in. And so it's serving two purposes, has those nesting features, has those foraging features, but also is collecting that runoff. Converting your lawn. I don't think I have to bang this drum too much here, but we have 40 million acres of lawn, and even if we took a tiny fraction of that and converted it to flowering landscape, using native plants, we would have so much more habitat, and it doesn't have to look messy. It could look like this yard here with some flowering vines, some clover and grassy area, shrubby herbs, and wildflowers. I think it looks pretty beautiful. Same here. This is a particular picture where they're using their yard to grow a lot of their own food, which also benefits pollinators. Blueberry, raspberry, elderberry, currants are all flowering fruiting shrubs that are visited by pollinators. And our garden herbs like mint, cilantro, dill, oregano are really attractive as well. So if you can't do large areas of permanent habitat, think of these kind of annual garden plants that not only benefit you, but benefit pollinators as well. Climate resilient landscapes. We know that, these native plants, deep-rooted native plants, are really good at sucking up flood water and tolerating periods of drought versus our lawns, which need a lot of care and watering and fertilization. Same concept here. This is at a visitor center at Lake Seneca. They had large areas of landscaped planting, native plants, so not necessarily a meadow, but it contains the same plants you would put in a meadow, and nicely edged out. So if you have some shape and some edge, whether it's, a brick or rock border, it's more acceptable for some reason. Something like this, right? Looks more purposeful. Detention ponds and basins, roadsides, right-of-ways, sidewalk strips. And again, not only thinking about flowers, but it's so critical to incorporate those nesting habitats, snags, stems, being aware of where ground nesting bees may be and reducing disturbance in those areas, such as having these stems, right? These cut stems where you could see little bee butts hanging out here. They're making a nest in these, raspberry, sumac, those hollow stemmed or pithy stemmed plants. And if we combine this all together, we could have a pollinator friendly neighborhood. This slide got out of place a little bit. I was expecting it earlier, but I thought this was a great study, and this will be, ending up here. But leaving the leaves versus using a leaf blower, this study in 2001 calculated that operating a gas-powered lawnmower for 1 hour produces as much pollution as a 100-mile car trip. So reducing mowing can be a great way to encourage those habitats for nesting and also regeneration of flowering plants. I thought this was pretty cool. And again, in 2011, a test by automotive experts showed that a consumer-grade leaf blower emits more pollutants than a 6,200-pound Ford F-150 Raptor, which is pictured here on the bottom. So essentially, you'd be more green doing your yard work with this truck. And then using these leaf blowers, and this is, related to pollinators in a way, but just, land stewardship in general is about the same as a 3,900-mile drive. So they're extremely polluting, and there can be implications not only for pollinators, but invertebrates in our rivers and streams. Somebody asked about how to get involved earlier. We have a Bee City and Bee Campus program. I don't run that, but I can put you in touch with my coworker Molly that does. But this is a mission where you have a bunch of like-minded people and you want to form a committee and make changes in your community, and they can be simple changes. You know, there's a scale of what you can do, but we can give you the resources to do so. Check out our YouTube channel. We have tons more webinars and videos posted there. Lots of stuff on our website. If you can't find it, please contact me. And I'd just like to say thank you for joining. You know, very small actions can make a big difference, and they all add up to be pretty substantial. So if you can get involved somehow, whether it's making changes in your landscape or becoming a partner in our community science projects, you are making a difference. And here is my email and some funny cartoons to end the presentation. And I think I went over time, but I'll be happy to take questions if people want to stick around.
Thank you, Kelly. That was awesome. We do have a few more questions. One question from David is, can you help with the confusion regarding native plants versus nativars in regard to pollinators?
Yes, and there is confusion, and I think there's just also mixed results. So we've worked with Penn State, and I know there's other studies. Annie White has been heading up in that, you know, we have particular plants that are bred for certain visual characteristics. And in that process, a lot of them are clones, or, you know, they're produced in a way where they don't have the same resources or accessible resources as our straight species. Some of them don't provide nectar or pollen at all. So if you think about cut flowers, like you would get a beautiful sunflower bouquet for your wedding, you know, they're bred to be pollenless because no bride wants pollen all over their dress. Well, those aren't good bee flowers, right? They don't have the resources. In other situations where we have nativars, we see mixed results. Some of the visitation is equivalent or similar to the straight species. In some cases, the straight species won, and in other cases, we see more visitation to some of these nativars. So when you see something like goldenrod and it has a name after it, like fireworks, that's a nativar, and it's hard to tease apart which ones are good, which ones, you know, are equivalent. The unfortunate thing is that's what you see more of in the nursery situation. So people may say, oh, you know, oh, goldenrod is good for pollinators. I'm going to get this because that's what they have access to. And it could be a good plant, but more often than not, we try to err on the side of caution and say, aim for this straight species whenever you can. There's some pretty good studies also by Mount Cuba Center in Delaware who have been doing, you know, these trials on nativars or cultivars for a while. And so if you want to read about different plant species, I would recommend going to their website. They've done trials on several different species.
Someone, she has a remark. She said, in her experience, bumblebees can be aggressive in the fall. So she's wondering if that's because they're getting ready for winter.
It could be. I haven't had the same experience. So we might need to talk about that more. You know, that's the time of year that a lot of the colony is dying off. And then, you know, there's some mating going on, and then the mated queen will overwinter and start a new colony the next year. But, you know, I don't have much to say on that other than, you know, you had a different experience than I usually do. And maybe you were in closer proximity to a nest at that point.
And someone asked, what about adding Dutch white clover into your lawn?
Dutch white clover, especially if you have areas of the lawn that are heavily traveled, or you want to keep open for, you know, throwing the frisbee, things like that. Dutch white clover can be a great addition. It's, you know, well visited by honeybees and bumblebees. but not preferred by some other bees. So better than grass alone, of course, but we want to make sure that we're also providing those native plants that a lot of our native bees, in particular the specialists, are very tied to. But that's definitely a start, for sure.
Another question is, what are those bee-safe options to deter mosquito larvae that you mentioned?
So there is BT, which is a bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, and there is a version of that that targets mosquito larvae in aquatic situations where bees are not exposed, and because it targets specific biology of mosquitoes and not bees, it's a more targeted option. And you can learn more about that in the guide I was talking about. You know, we have this community guide, and then we also have a big booklet of, you know, ecologically friendly mosquito control options.
I do not see any other questions. I don't know about you, Sue. Do you see any that I missed?
No, but Kelly, is that guide on the website? Are people able to view that on the website, or is it something you have to download or buy?
They could download it for free or view it on the website. And if you have trouble finding it, we've recently redone our website, and so we're still working out some kinks. So, you know, my email address, kelly.gill@xerces.org, right there. You could, if you're simply looking for that, you know, I could get it to you pretty quickly. Just email me. I'd be happy to send you a PDF.
The only question I saw, I did answer, but I don't know if you might have a different take on it. Someone asked really early on regarding hazardous waste, or not hazardous waste, excuse me, insecticide disposal, old insecticides, pesticides. What would you do to get rid of them? Is there a safe place to do that?
So I'm not an expert here, but I could help. There are, you know, safe recycling centers, and then there also, and I don't know about where this might be in New Jersey, but agricultural recycling centers that recycle materials and chemicals. But if you are looking for something more specific, email me and I could get in touch with our pesticide program director. She really knows that inside and out. My work more focuses on habitat work, so I could get you that answer. But it definitely is important, and we just saw, you know, some instances in Nebraska where, you know, there was some repercussions with how insecticide treated seed was dealt with.
And I know sometimes for homeowners, your township usually has a hazardous waste collection, but that's another place. Usually, that's what I put in the chat. So, and there was one other question. Again, I did mention about ticks. A couple of people were asking, is there something, you know, how do you deal with the no-see-ums, which kind of goes into the same thing with you were talking about the mosquito controls and not hurting the bees. And sometimes I think people need to figure out what's going to be more important for them at the time that they need to, correcting habitat more so than actually doing any spraying.
Yes, yes. And, you know, there's, you know, if you make a habitat, you know, walking in tall grasses, yes, there can be ticks in there. There can be other biting insects. But you could also just mow a path through that and keep some areas open. Make sure you're wearing, you know, long sleeves, long pants. I know it's uncomfortable. And then also you can do a test run if you are going to walk in a meadow or you have your own meadow and you want to kind of get into the weeds, so to speak, you could drag a white in there and just do like a tick sample and see how, you know, if it's loaded with ticks, then maybe you don't want to go in there. But there is evidence going both ways, and so, you know, we just want to be precautionary with our own health. but typically those ticks aren't parachuting out of the air. They're climbing up us from the ground up. So when you find them in your hair like me, it's really gross, right?
Yes, they can always send us some pictures too, but
All right. I think that is all. I think you answered all the questions.
All right, everyone. Well, email me if you think of something afterwards, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kelly. We really appreciate it. It was a great talk. And everyone, please remember that we recorded this and you'll be able to watch it again if you care to. Tomorrow, the link will be on our website.
Thank you, everyone, so much.